Welcome to my channel, The Magic of Java. This is my third book called The Londo and the Green Queen's Revenge. It's a novel. It's a novel about me coming to terms with the attempted destruction of an Englishman and his Javanese family. But it is a novel. Yes, it's based on experience. It's based on real people and celebrities, but amalgams of real people or caricatures of them. So if you do identify yourself, please forgive me, because it's only intended as a yarn. To see the world in a grain of sand. As always, when I'm visiting Jakarta, I went to see Martin and Davina and found them to be as low as I have ever known. When governor of Jakarta, Jokowi had developed the concept of one-stop shops for public services. Given that Piety never provides us with any information, nor introduces us to any schemes that would make our lives easier, I've not come across these one-stop shops. Or maybe they only apply to investors, which is Martin and Davina's legal status. In the West, these one-stop shops are designed to remove bureaucracy and reduce problems for business and citizens, and that certainly was the intention. But local officials have interpreted their remit as being to check every document to ensure that it conforms to each other, which they never do. I believe these mistakes are deliberate, but may simply reflect poor systems and low educational levels. So the very problems these one-stop shops were designed to eliminate have turned into impossible challenges for citizens and business. Within public sector management, this is known as perverse policy syndrome. Remembering my illiterate brother-in-law number 3, and not one of his official documents conform, I could not see him ever accessing public services in Jakarta. In the unlikely event he was to be granted residence in the city. These issues are probably related to the same issues with phone and school registration, by which one's ID card and family card are compared, and any discrepancy results in your registration being rejected. So like me, Martin and Davina are trapped in Indonesia, but living in fear they will eventually be deported. But to where? And to what? Although, of course, it's not perverse policy if this policy is a deliberate conspiracy. When I was at my lowest, after leaving Mawa in Gunung Kidul and unable to think straight, Martin had counselled me on keeping my paperwork up to date. It had only served to increase my paranoia that I would be deported, leaving Mawa with nowhere to care for her, and I back in the UK, depleted my assets and money. Whilst Martin's words were intended as kindly advice, I had no idea they were based on his own experience, that he and Davina had been somewhat remiss and that everything had backfired on them. Indeed, as I was later conclude, they had been foolish in conducting their personal affairs, making the sort of error which racks me with fear, but which I never actually make, even when under immense pressure. A part of my trepidation about visiting Jakarta was not simply related to forcing myself to visit Namashola, but there is an also increasing feeling to a Bule Westerner I no longer feel safe in Jakarta. This feeling not only relates to my family's recent experience, but general feelings that politicians are attempting to create a crisis by stoking up Indonesia's distrust of foreigners, which will eventually result in rioting, thereby creating a power vacuum to fill. On Merdeka, or Independence Day, I received an SMS informing me that it was everyone's duty to defend the nation. Defend from whom? The only people I'm aware of that Indonesia needs defending from are those who send such messages. Of course, this was probably a random message, as if not, it would imply that the Indonesian security services who listen in on my conversations are targeting foreigners to send such incendiary messages to. But of course that my neighbour and best friends tried to kill my family and I almost certainly colours my perception. So when Martin told me that an Indonesian Muslim neighbour was moving to Australia because he too believed Jakarta to be becoming unsafe, I realised that I should take heed of my feelings. Over a year later, a good Chinese Indonesian friend told me that he too was considering emigrating to Australia. Maybe unspectacular, except that he owns the most expensive real estate in Jakarta and is very much a part of its elite. I was reminded of how, by being seen writing in their notebooks while walking in the countryside, was seen as evidence of spying for the French when Wordsworth and Coleridge moved to the Quantocks. But then Indonesia has not experienced romanticism, and my very presence in the mountains of Gunung Kidul, even without a notebook, is enough to seem suspicious, despite the French having no designs on its karst mountains, having plenty of their own. Whilst on the night bus, Branwell had contacted me. I knew that his phone was broken, but now he also claimed to have lost his passport and bank card. Worse still, he was still $1,400 in debt and his bank, and so needed around $3,000. If this is to be believed, he's spending around $140 a day. Surely he's either addicted to something or being exploited by somebody. I questioned Branwell, and he assured me that he is not being exploited and that he is not addicted to anything. But there is obviously something he's not telling me. What he did say was that he is schizophrenic. The first time I had my suspicions confirmed. When I studied for my master's degree, I shared a flat with a fellow student from Llanidloes. I observed him during the early stages of schizophrenia. I never saw him at his worst, as by then I had moved to Saudi Arabia. Not that I have any idea of his fate. I felt that I detected these same signs in Branwell many years before he was sectioned, and took him to our doctor, who after some questions reassured me that Branwell was fine, and I thought little of it until his committal. I also recall when he first went to grammar school, a psychometric test had identified a problem with Branwell, but we were never told what it was, and whilst we accessed support, it was only cognitive behavioural therapy, the psychologist giving him a clean bill of mental health. Although I've been concerned about Branwell's deteriorating mental health and found it impossible to access assistance for him in the UK, after all, I'm only his father. After hearing this news, I had the first nightmare that I can recall since the dark spirit attacked me. I believe to have been sent by Paate. In this new dream, I was being pursued by a woman, and each room I took shelter in, she was there. I remember calling out my father, but he never answered me. How should I interpret this dream? Had my own mother was it my own mother attempting to keep me all to herself, or could it have been that I am the father not answering Branwell's cries? If so, then the woman is Branwell's mother, who I have always felt to be bipolar, but am becoming increasingly convinced that she's a psychopath. My former partner has a history of winning people, even household pets, over by love bombing, then controlling them by losing them their family and friends, before destroying their confidence, even their minds, and finally discarding them. These are all classic traits of a psychopath. Maybe the most telling phrase she would say, "You've ruined my day now, there is no point in doing anything else." A classic double bind of the psychopath. Indeed, isn't this a form of black magic, rather like the evil eye? The arguments with my partner were the worst I'd ever experienced, not least as should never apologise or compromise, so much that I learnt to disengage. Actually, At first, I simply mirrored her disengagement until it became total disengagement from the relationship. Indeed, she would physically back me into a corner, even hit me in what I believed was an attempt to provoke me to hit her back, so that I could be accused of wife battering. In fact, almost always these arguments occurred when I caught her out lying, or that her logic has changed. Their ferocity induced as she completely denied my accusations, despite me being certain of them. So disengagement really was the best reaction. These arguments were always the worst when we went on holiday, and given that during much of our time together I worked 80 hours a week, these were something I cherished. It was as if she had determined to take away my happiness. Although if I am correct that she is a psychopath, total disengagement, even when there is a need to discuss Branwell, is the only sensible strategy. During arguments, she would lie and make excuses, be condescending and patronising, even sarcastic, be hypocritical, change the conversation to something designed to hurt me the most, play the eternal victim, show no empathy. I recalled when I administered a personality test on my former partner as my training for the British Psychological Society, and the results being somewhat disturbing. I do remember checking the clinical explanation of the profile, but honestly cannot remember what the prognosis was. Whilst worrying, we all saw it as something of a joke at the time. She did, however, refuse to take another test, as though in some way she'd been found out. I do recall that it showed her to have a very low on the creativity scale, despite her being an artist. Why did I never seek help with my partner? Well, she convinced me that it was I who had mental illness, and I was concerned that she would be able to convince mental health practitioners of the same, which I believe she has with Branwell's team. But we are all blind to the extreme behaviour until we finally disengage. Had my own paranoia and confusion been sent so that I could understand what my son experienced as a schizophrenic? I know how small problems like misplacing your bank card lead to big problems like losing your passport, and know that one has to learn to deal with such issues, breaking the spiral of paranoia. Or was losing his bank card and passport a deliberate act in reaction to paranoia? Branwell is trapped in caring the community, which means neglecting the community. A community which is becoming increasingly harsh on people with mental illness. How can Branwell function without his phone, bank card and passport in today's world? Then he has become enticed to go overdrawn at the bank without realising that he is now trapped in a cycle of bank charges and interest that he has no ability to break. Eventually, care in the community becomes suicide or murder in the community. So the word community has become a tautology. Maybe this is all part of his mental health team's mission to disempower and make him dependent on the state, which presumably secures them more resources from central government. Just as in previous generations, people like my son were institutionalised and, given his violence, probably subjected to ECT and or a lobotomy. I speculate that our renovation of our apartment in Manchester released so much lead from paint that was stripped and particles from exhaust fumes that were disturbed that this would increase my former partner's mania and manipulation. The ingestion of lead would have been the highest when she was pregnant with Branwell. Could this have been related to his schizophrenia? I am now sleeping for about twice as long as I did only a few months ago, and as I have done for years without this additional sleep, appears to be dreaming more, or at least being aware of my dreams. For for as long as 6 hours sleep a night was something of a triumph, and I recall many nights with little or no sleep, perspiration pouring from me, tired but completely unable to sleep. Now I regularly get 7 hours sleep, topped up with an afternoon nap, but every other day I sleep for 10 or 11 hours. I'm not even slightly concerned about this massive increase in my sleep and feel fantastic, even though signs of skin cancer appear to be retreating once more, whilst I'm applying them with neem, Indian lilac oil, to them. I am sure that the main reason is simply positive thinking. I realise that the conscious mind, having been through so much, it is now an opportunity for the unconscious mind to catch up and make some sense of all that has happened, resolving all those issues and unexplained phenomena that I may once again integrate back into normality. The bank were refusing to give Branwell any more money until the $1,400 was paid off, which I eventually did. But first I asked Patrick to go round with some groceries, as Branwell claimed not to have eaten in 4 days, and to look for his passport and bank card. Patrick, like everybody else I know, was less charitable about Branwell, claiming that he was too lazy to help himself. But of course this is a symptom of schizophrenia. Patrick also believed that Branwell had sold his passport and phone to pay for skunk, which I can believe. Indeed, some years later, Branwell mentioned selling his bank card to a Nigerian gang, so I'm probably correct in concluding that this included his passport. We heard from Widiati that Titi wanted to move back into our home in South Jakarta, which I'm delighted about. It seemed to me that Titi compensates for Widati's shortcomings, and that it'll work out cheaper running just 2 homes. Widati is concerned that Titi is seeing her pre-man boyfriend again and wants to move back so that he can stay with her, which Widati feels unable to prevent. And so it has been for over a year. As one problem seems to weaken its control of me, another opens up. I must maintain my high level of vibrations by remaining positive. This seemed to work, as Titi moved back into our house in South Jakarta, and whilst the Preman is trying to see her, she wants nothing to do with him. And this young bully is frightened of Widati. But once again I received a warning whilst praying. I knew it was nothing too sinister, but nevertheless it was a warning. The next morning I heard that Widati had broken her phone, and I was reminded how alike Branwell and her are. Neither both are in their early 20s, neither working, and both think that things like this happen. I have a duty to buy them new phones. Indonesians, especially Widati, would never consider buying a cheap Chinese phone. They used to insist on Blackberries until the Canadian country manager was imprisoned, and then they moved on to iPhones, which I suspect Widati will want. But many people have now moved again to Samsung. Whatever, they're all expensive options, and far more expensive than the Chinese model I use. Sure enough, Widati wanted an iPhone, but agreed to buy a second-hand version of the latest model, still 3 times more expensive than my Chinese phone was when new. Mas Pradipta returned from Jakarta a week after me in a truck with many of our belongings, but not the deeds of our house in Gunung Kidul. I set about putting the batik painting of Nearer Kidul back in its frame, and it looks stunning in our home in Gunung Kidul, whereas in Jakarta it was just lost. I was standing back admiring it when I realised that the carriage was now pointing in the opposite direction, albeit towards a home in the Southern Ocean. How could this have happened? My Indonesian family all came up with explanations that our houses pointed in different directions, which actually they don't, but this was a nonsensical argument anyway. After quite some time, I realised the batik paintings are somewhat the same either side, and I had put it into its frame with the reverse on show. Anyway, it looks pretty good, and for now at least Nia is returning to the ocean and not going to solo. Mas Predictor had also bought some paint Mao had bought from itinerant sellers from Surabaya, only to find that it's low-quality paint packaged in good quality drums. He felt that it would be okay for outside painting, possibly because it contains too much lead for indoors. Thus I set about painting the outside bathroom, some 2 years after I had asked the builder to paint it. Of course, the sight of a bule doing manual work attracted comments from all our neighbours, as no middle-class Indonesian would dream of lowering themselves to such menial work. Indeed, mothers and fathers would bring their children to sit on our wall and gape at the sign of a white man painting his outside privy, as did my Duke and brother-in-law, who would wait until I was full stretch before shouting out a question in Javanese, undoubtedly related to his own son having once found this work beneath him. I am sure that I will attract are comments, but there exists a rumour of bules being deported for infringing their non-work permit status by doing lesser jobs around their homes. Like my father, I have always rolled up my sleeves when jobs need doing. It's not an attempt to shame those who we employ into activity, nor really about not expecting others to do what we don't do ourselves. No, it's simply if there is work to be done, then we are no more important than anyone else. After 2 coats of paint, I realised it was little better than distemper, and would require at least 4 coats. It ended up having 6, and I was not entirely happy. In fact, not since becoming an adult had such a paint job caused me such anguish. I remember as a child my father snatching the paintbrush from my hand, claiming that I was cack-handed, saying, Look, do it like this." Like what? I was only more confused and grasped the brush tightly, putting even more force on it and making an even bigger mess. There are 2 reasons for Indonesians' attitudes towards manual work. Firstly, the remnants of a caste-like system mean that decorating, gardening, cleaning, even driving are seen as occupations for people who are sub-unum, below the caste system. So if work needs doing, such as painting the outside toilet, middle-class Indonesians will hire the local handyman, even if they need the exercise. Spotting their expanding waste, they will then get their driver to take them to Pondok Indah Mall, PIM, to buy the latest Nike trainers and tracksuit. Of course, in PIM, they will bump into neighbours and distant family members and decide to have lunch together. This lunch will be so generous, they will have to cancel their driver from taking them to the gym, and they will spend the afternoon taking a rest. The trainers and tracksuit will lie in their designer bags, probably never to be opened, next to the rowing machine they bought during their last pang of guilt. But in a few exceptional cases, they may even get driven to the gym in Chitos, where they will buy a membership and training regime with a personal trainer, never to return again. The second reason is that wage rates for such occupations are so low, there is little point in doing the work yourself, and in any case you have an obligation to provide such work. But also to a point why Indonesians believe all bules to be wealthy beyond imagination. Indonesians will be aware of the wage levels paid to manual workers in the West, and therefore assume that the differentials also apply, making wage levels for non-manual work astronomical, when the truth is that many professional and white-collar occupations are as well paid in Indonesia as in the West, and certainly when taking into account the cost of living, such people are much better off in Indonesia than the West. Martin and Davina asked if I could loan them $2,000, and I was racked with doubt. But when I first met with them, I turned down a similar request after my partner convinced me it was foolhardy. I'd always regretted this, and now was my opportunity to make amends. Nevertheless, I kept getting messages that I was not to. Maybe this is another test of my higher vibrations. As I recalled that my misfortune followed a series of bad debts, including $6,000 to a Nigerian friend and $23,000 to an associate of Professor Darwin's. To think that I live on around half of $29,000 a year, and how useful this money would be now. After realising that I'd been tricked out of $23,000, I became bitter, resolving never to loan any money to anyone again, and this bitterness was really the start of my pessimism. Here is an opportunity to show the world that my pendulum has indeed swung. But then the doubt is that it should not be replayed. I would be devastated and have lost my only remaining bule friends in Indonesia. Worse still, if it would not be repaid, plunge me back into the pessimism I had only so very recently shaken off. Martin explained to me that their problems were occurring at exactly the same time as my own, and they were delighted to find that I had managed to break the cycle of pessimism and self-destruction, but theirs continued. While seemingly completely unrelated, I wonder if there is a common cause to our problems, and of course there is. I have already indicated that the hatred of foreigners, and especially Westerners, is being created and manipulated in Indonesia for political purposes. This environment was enough to give my neighbours the courage to believe that they would get away with killing me and my family without repercussion. As Steve Marriott and Ronnie Lane wrote, "Wouldn't it be nice to get on with me neighbours? But they make it very clear they've got no room for ravers." On reflection, this began prior to the last election, and also seems like a deliberate policy to substitute Indonesia's traditional Chinese scapegoats with Westerners. There are now so few foreigners in Indonesia that it only takes a small proportion of the local population, especially when there are so many of Dostoevsky's underground men, to make their lives of Westerners in Indonesia impossible. This environment has also probably led to an official to believe that he is duty to see Westerners deported, especially those who no longer seem to be making a contribution towards the Indonesian economy. Of course, this policy could originate higher up even than with Jokowi, but I think it's more likely it is simply a local interpretation of policy, or given that the persecution of Westerners predates Jokowi's first election, is their deportation related to a conspiracy within the deep state? Just maybe the deportation of bules has a humanitarian aspect. You see, in Indonesia, bules have been virtually hunted to extinction, and whilst they may breed less in their country of origin, they're more likely to recover their numbers. When I look at what is currently happening with Indonesia, it seems to me that minor crises are being manufactured wherever I look. I suspect the reason is largely to create so much confusion nobody will notice a major crisis which will ultimately lead to Jokowi's deposal. Or maybe the strategy is to make Indonesia ungovernable and hope that one minor problem will grow so big that it will destabilise the government. During the Merdeka celebrations, a group of Papuan students were attacked in Surabaya for not displaying the national flag. In fact, the students had no objection to displaying the flag. It was simply that their dormitory caretaker had not arranged it. Such is the self-fulfilling nature of the crisis emerging in Indonesia. Were these the enemies the country needed defending from? The following year, the violence became more serious in Surabaya, sparking demonstrations and some rioting across Papua, and renewed calls for a vote of independence, increased security, and arrests for treason. So the fear of a handful of dreadlocked youths armed with sticks led to racism, which is now leading to calls for the breakup of Indonesia, which was behind the fear in the first place, a potential threat from less than 1% of Indonesia's population. Nevertheless, President Jokowi pulled a rabbit out of the hat, not offering independence, but 4G mobile connections to Papua. So maybe there really are illusions set to hide the real agenda. After all, the presidential election candidates are selected by a small cabal. So could everything really be orchestrated by this cabal? A bizarre twist to this was the closing of a large number of Facebook accounts related to Papua, but originating from a PR company. As always, the overall effect was total confusion. But just maybe it was to convey the message that the unrest was caused by foreigners. If this was paid for by the government, it is worrying. But if by the army or opposition, it is extremely worrying. Some leads suggested that it was paid for by the former deputy president, further stoking my concerns about the deep state. The electricity company kept playing games with me, explaining something about estimated and actual readings of my meter, without ever acknowledging that I don't live in the UK, don't own the property, and that the property has been empty for 2 years. Then my banking software stopped working again. I chatted along online to many helpful Indians, but unlike those used by utility companies in the UK. But as always, my requests were met with, "Why don't you?" And when we'd exhausted the options, they informed me that there was nothing else they could do. In other words, if we cannot use online or mobile banking, they no longer want our custom. I appear to have been slow in picking up on the "why don't you" becoming ubiquitous around the world, and I'm met with incredulity when I reply, "Why shouldn't I?" For security reasons, the coders have disallowed intermittent internet connections. That's the only sort of connection available to me, and such is the way we're all being slowly disenfranchised from society. This means that I'm unable to send Branwell any more money, which may be a blessing, but also unable to get money to Indonesia. This probably explains the messages I was getting not to send Martin some money, as it will now leave me short of cash, especially as his 2 weeks estimate to repay me is now 3 months. But I have faced such issues before, and I am now no longer sent into a blind panic by them. However, given that I have already spent 5 hours trying to resolve my banking issues, and will have to spend many more, illustrating how I am kept busy in Indonesia. Much later, my Indonesian bank card kept being rejected. Each time I was told to visit a branch, which would take me a day and cost me $30 from Gudangkidul. Eventually my suspicions were confirmed that my bank had not bought enough bandwidth on its new transaction system. Friends in the UK will say, what do you do with all your time? But never believe me that most of my days are spent doing things which are so simple in the UK. Throughout our torment, my problems, every premonition I have had has come true. But then, when I think about it, throughout my life, I have worried about something could go wrong. It has gone wrong. So many times I've said to myself, and occasionally others, they're going to do this, they're going to mess up, and it's always been self-fulfilling. Of course it's been self-fulfilling. If everything is in our minds, our very fears become our reality. Indeed, the more we fear something, the more likely it is to happen. This is why, when I believed that I was under the influence of black magic, the worst I could imagine happens. Now I'm only saying that Omuni and Pa Angabaya weren't using black magic and that they weren't poison, but it simply set up a cycle of paranoia, and our own fears did the rest. We can free ourselves from this by freeing ourselves from our fears and understanding that we live in abundance and have nothing to fear. Of course, we're all subject to fears, both logical and illogical, but simply do not dwell on them and see them as funny and laugh at them. But when we develop philosophy and ideology based on these fears, the results are catastrophic. We fall into authoritarianism and cruelty, which breeds further fear and a cycle of authoritarianism and cruelty. So we are left with a surveillance society we live in today, believing that the followers of a religion which has love as its essence are attempting to destroy our society, whilst all along allowing our governments to brutalise, even kill, more fellow humans, creating a self-fulfilling prophecy. Once one gets into such a cycle of pessimism, one begins to externalise fate, believing that God or someone else is sending this misfortune to you, and so a cycle of paranoia develops. Now imagine that you are convinced that your neighbours are sending illness and misfortune through black magic, and you can see how destructive this cycle becomes. Added to this, problems with banks, financial service companies and utilities go from irritation to become a conspiracy to destabilise you. And in my case, with emigrating, these problems were multiplied, so that 2 years after emigrating, I'm still to resolve some of them. This is more than enough to create physical ailments through worry and stress. But we really felt ill as a result of ingesting heavy metals. The cycle itself was enough to have killed us, let alone the heavy metal toxicity, which would have killed us within a month had we kept ingesting the lead acetate Pa Angabaya had given to us. But we can dispel fear and move to a higher vibration. If there is no self and no time and place, these are mere illusions, and we have to fear. Change, the unknown, death. Change is a natural state of the universe, and there for our benefit. We should embrace it, not fear it. Death is to a degree the unknown. Surely it's just a phase with no beginning and no end, a phase within a cycle of birth, development, maturity and death. And whilst I see reincarnation as too simplistic, yes, death is a signal of rebirth. For if consciousness is separate from the human form, then surely it survives after the human form dies. We believe security comes from having enough money, but when we live in a universe without shortages, there is nothing to fear from letting go. There is nothing to fear as we do not control our environment, simply accept it. But insurance is the ultimate usury. It is built on creating fears about what we lose and being plunged into scarcity, making the marketing of insurance the ultimate dark art. So we built our society on fear when there is nothing to fear, a society of scarcity when there is plenty, a society of hatred when everything is blessed with God's love. No serious sociologist any longer believes that the voice of a people expresses any divine or specifically wise and lofty idea. The voice of the people expressed the mind of the people, and that the mind is made up by the group leaders, and it is believed by those persons who understand and manipulate the manipulation of public opinion. It is composed of inherited prejudice and symbols and cliches and verbal formulas supplied to them by the leaders. Edward Earl Bernays, Propaganda. Bernays was Sigmund Freud's nephew, who shifted marketing from the functional buy cigarettes to desire cigarettes make you sexy, and promoting his uncle's ideas created the fetishes of consumerism and individualism. Deep down, we know that our ideology is a facade, a collaboration that we all subconsciously adhere to. This is the source of our inner self of unfulfillment and unhappiness, an unfulfillment we attempt to offset with unbound consumerism and hedonism. Later that very day, when we went to visit Parkano, it was obvious to all that Mawar was now well. Pa asked me how my visit to Jakarta was, and I just said fine, but somehow I think he'd been looking out for me whilst in Jakarta. Maybe just through prayer. I wish I'd asked him more. Parkano mentioned that there was a blood-red moon that night. He did not mention that it was auspicious, but I felt it might be, so I got up at 3 o'clock in the morning. But although the moon was large and strange, it certainly wasn't red. When I came back to bed, I cuddled Mawar, and we fell asleep in each other's arms. Some things we hadn't done in years, and it just seemed so natural, whereas for around 2 years we'd been too preoccupied with ourselves. When we awoke, I caught a glimpse of Maddie as she was when we first met, and it is at least 2 years since I've seen this side of my wife. This was a woman content with the world, a woman content in herself and her environment, a woman who could get any man she wanted in FTs. Where had this person been hiding? To Mawar, and almost all around me, Mawar had been possessed by evil spirits. And it's true that I'd seen many removed from her. But this is no longer my only explanation. Why should Mawar and most Indonesians believe her to have been possessed, and I now largely reject it? Well, our beliefs inform our consciousness. Our consciousness creates our reality, and life and death are constructs of our consciousness. So because I no longer fully believe that Mawar was possessed, it is no longer my reality. But I'm yet to convince Mawar that everything is in the mind. I am not discounting possession, but seeing everything as being within the mind. So it is only the spirit possession. It is how we believe it to be. Every man takes the limits of his own field of vision for the limits of the world. Arthur Schopenhauer, Studies in Pessimism, the Essays. We were all convinced by Newtonian materialism until around 100 years ago, and many of us still are. So Newtonian materialism was our reality. Paradoxically, Newton himself was an Antirethean Christian, an occultist fascinated by Solomon's Temple, possibly even a Rosicrucian, who dedicated much of his time to the study of alchemy. Although this work was not published during his lifetime, quantum mechanics began to chip away at our certainty in Newtonian rationality, and our reality began to become less certain and predictable. For example, neuroscience has shown that we experience sensations some 6 seconds before they occur, proving that everything is in the mind and an illusion, even questioning the existence and certainty that the nature of consciousness. What we call reality, we project us outside, and then when we observe it, we observe what we have created, we become immersed in our own reality. But once we introduce such doubts into a dominant value system, our whole reality is under attack. So now the only way to maintain reality is through the reinforcement of the value system, until a new paradigm is created. Indeed, once a scientist has a new profound theory, we begin to discover the evidence to prove this previously unbelievable theory. Science cannot solve the ultimate mystery of nature, and that is because in the last analysis, we ourselves are a part of that mystery that we are trying to solve. Max Planck, where is science going? I am not accusing science of fraud in making such discoveries, just stating that science is a part of our illusion of reality, no more and no less valid than metaphysics, apart from the sum energy of its believers. Indeed, because metaphysics is what is above physics, if the physical is an illusion, then maybe we need different terms. Certainly the Cartesian split between them doesn't help. It is for this reason that I've avoided calling reality a hologram, a matrix, not because they are invalid observations, but because we believe in something if it becomes our reality. It is worth, however, commenting that whilst many scientists reject the notion of God as a higher consciousness, they spend considerable time attempting to prove the plot of a movie not to be true. Alarming though this may seem, when we lived within a different paradigm prior to Newton, including Newton himself, and many modern Indonesians, Mauer included, live in an almost pre-Newtonian paradigm. It is only when we view the lens through the lens of Darwinistic progress that we become alarmed by such change. But if we concede the wisdom of our ancestors and embrace the dialectic, then such change is sentience. But even my explanation is too simple. Like spirit possession, it is simply a device to understand that which maybe we cannot. For everything to be within one's mind, focused too much on the individual, it internalises everything, whereas spirit possession externalises everything. We're all connected through our minds. Our consciousness is a collective consciousness. So the internal and the external explanations are the obverse of the same coin, not broadening the explanation to the complexity which I know to exist. Therefore, it is not us who actually project reality, but our higher self, our higher consciousness, a consciousness I have chosen to call Allah, but believe that this is a collective consciousness which sometimes revealed to us through our subconscious. Nevertheless, in suggesting that maybe we cannot understand this, I am engaging in the very same hegemony which prevents us from contemplating the multiple universes which exists, alternatives to the universe we all cling to. I was going to liken this to a fungi. We see individual mushrooms sticking up through the soil, but unseen to us, they're all part of the same living organism. But even this is too simplistic. We are also connected to all other living organisms, so it really should be different species of mushrooms are connected below the ground. As Blake observed in The Marriage of Heaven and Hell, everything that lives is holy. I could go on infinitely in this analogy and never reach anything like an adequate description, for the next twist is that we're all connected to what we call inanimate objects, to the universe as a whole, to every universe. It truly is infinite, albeit that our own universe may be large but finite. Maybe the World Wide Web is a better metaphor, especially as we approach the Internet of Things, although I'm not sure that pictures of cats really incorporate the animal and the plant kingdoms adequately. There are times when inanimate objects do not behave as Newton nor quantum theory would predict, and appear to be not only affected by human consciousness, but also to exhibit free will, quantum entanglement. Bell's theorem attempts to explain this without recourse to a hidden or yet undiscovered variable, by hypothesizing that everything impacts on everything else. To see the world in a grain of sand and heaven in a wildflower, hold infinity in the palm of your hand and eternity in an hour. William Blake, Auguries of Innocence. At Parcano's house, my mobile signal was strong enough to log on to my bank, where I transfer some funds to myself and Branwell. I have a solution, if not a completely satisfactory one, a solution which only 2 months ago I would not thought of, such was my paranoia and pessimism. Maybe this is how positive thinking works. You simply have the confidence in yourself and in life to keep trying out solutions rather than accepting the worst. Then a week later, I was able to access the bank site from my laptop once more. Of course, a brain clouded by heavy metal poisoning didn't help either. I cannot emphasise enough how disturbing it is to lose some of one's mental capacity, how one's world changes for the worst, and there is so little that you can seemingly do about it. Well, that concludes this chapter from my book, The Londo and the Green Queen's Revenge, which is my third book in the series. I do hope you've enjoyed it. I'm hoping to add further chapters about every week, and so far I've managed to do this. If you'd like to hear more from me, then please subscribe and hit the bell. That way you get notifications of when a new chapter is released. In addition, I don't seem to be working very well with these algorithms on YouTube, and my videos really aren't being promoted as they should. So if you could also hit the like button and sort of make some comments, I think that will help me to get noticed. I hate to ask you that, but I really do need more viewers. But thank you for this viewing. Thank you so much.